So thank you, and it's a very real pleasure to be able to present today at this Australian Technical Committee Seminar for 2021. My name is Greg Hesse. I work with PowerLink Queensland here in Brisbane, and I'm the convener of Australian Panel CIGRE C2. I'm also a member of CIGRE Study Committee C2. And as you can see on our presentation, Study Committee C2 is concerned with the study of power system operation and control. Now, I always like to say that Study Committee C2 is somewhat unique in the CIGRE world in that our scope of work is not focused primarily or solely necessarily on technical matters. The work of C2 extends to those human resource aspects and also the institutions involved in power system operation to the extent that they influence and impact on that operation and control of the power system. We're interested in the secure and economic operation of the power system and the protection and the resilience of the power system against disintegration, equipment damage, and most importantly, injuries to humans. Each year when I do these presentations, I try to find a different photo from a control centre, and the photo this year is from the control room of one of the transmission operators in the Balkans area, which was involved in a split of the continental European power system in January this year, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later in this presentation. Turning now to an overview of the structure of Study Committee C2. Our chair for the last 12 months or so has been Jamie Maceda from Brazil, ably assisted by his secretary Flavio. You'll notice that compared to a number of other study committees, C2, we don't have a particularly large number of working groups. And the other thing I would highlight is that we do tend to have a fairly high proportion of joint working groups amongst our total number of working groups. And we commonly work jointly with Study Committee C4 on those aspects of power system performance, or Study Committee C5 and the interaction with energy markets. The remainder of our working groups we delineate into the green colour representing those related to the real-time system operation and control, the orange colour being around system operational planning and performance analysis, and the yellow being the actual control centre infrastructure and human resources for system operation. So they're the active working groups currently under Study Committee C2. In terms of main activities during 2021, just say that I became convener of Australian Panel C2 at the end of 2017, so my first Paris session was in August 2018. And that session, there were a number of working groups that were having their first meeting. And it's been really fascinating to watch the development of the work of those working groups. And 3 of those working groups have completed their work this year, and that's those 3 technical brochures that have been produced around system operational resilience by Working Group C225, the Working Group on TSO-DSO Control Centre Tools Cooperation, Working Group C240, and most recently, just in the last month, the technical brochure 851 has been published from the Joint Working Group C2-C441 on the impact of high penetration of inverter-based generation on inertia. We've also had, during the course of the year, a number of C2 related items published in the CIGRE Science and Engineering Journal this year. And I would make a particular call out to Babek from Australia. Babek's been a fairly prolific contributor with 3 separate papers actually being published in the CSE, CIGRE Science and Engineering this year. And I just want to particularly highlight the paper on the screen there as being an example of how Australia can demonstrate its ability to lead the world in certain aspects of the energy transition we're undergoing, and I would recommend that article as a good read for any who are interested in that aspect of power systems. Regarding the Centennial session in Paris, one of the highlights at each Paris session is the Large Disturbance Workshop held jointly with Study Committee C2 and C5. There were 5 events that were discussed during this Large Disturbance Workshop, and a couple I just wanted to highlight with the visuals also on this screen. The blackout in Sri Lanka, I found the description of that particularly interesting. That was an example of a event occurring under quite low demand conditions. And what had happened was that there was a loss of a critical voltage control device, being a large generator. And through the loss of the large generator and the consequent under-frequency load shedding, which reduced the load even further, but also the loss of that voltage control from that large generator, led ultimately to uncontrolled high voltages and a different form of almost a voltage collapse, but in reverse, where these high voltages ultimately led to tripping of elements of the power system and eventually a total power system collapse in Sri Lanka. So I found that quite interesting and topical, given some of the experiences we have in Australia under low demand conditions and being able to manage those high voltage situations. The other visual there is a heat map taken from the European system split that happened in January of this year, January 2021. And this heat map uses voltage phase angle measurements from phase and monitoring units, or PMUs, that are distributed across the power system in Europe. And I just wanted to bring that up because I think it provides a really quite clever and very clear visual cue to those in the operations space of where a problem exists on the power system. Given the extremely large and complex nature of the European system, it's not always immediately observable with lines crossing multiple asset owners. Not immediately obvious necessarily where a problem can lie. So using tools such as these wide area monitoring systems facilitated by PMUs provides that extra layer of situational awareness in a control center environment. In terms of where Study Committee C2 is heading in our recently formed working groups, over many years there had been a joint working group between C2 and C5 that had examined a number of different topics related to the interactions between electricity markets and power system operations. Now that long-term working group was formally wound up about 2 years ago, and the new joint working group C2 C5 06 is the first of the new joint working groups considering these interactions between electricity markets and power system operations. So it's good to see that work continuing. And new working group C242 is, as far as I'm aware, the first working group we've had at C2 to explore those artificial intelligence aspects in power system operations as a dedicated subject. Some other work has probably touched on the emergence of AI or machine learning as, yes, here's another tool available in the toolkit for power system operations. But working group C242 is focusing specifically on that use of machine learning and artificial intelligence and where it can take us from an operational perspective. During our working group meeting for Study Committee C2, we discussed ideas for possible new working groups. In terms of the dynamic system analysis subject, the prevalence of power electronic controls recently across the power system is meaning that many of the traditional tools used in power system control rooms are struggling to keep up. And might want to consider, well, what does a new generation of those dynamic system analysis tools offer us from an operations perspective? Offshore wind generation, not surprisingly, got a lot of interest from our European colleagues. It may not be quite so relevant to Australia at this time. But one thing that did get a lot of interest within the Australian panel for C2 when we met the last 2 weeks was the possibility of working group to look at what are the operational strategies for managing these new minimums we see on the power system, whether it's minimum demand, minimum inertia, minimum system strength. That's certainly got a lot of interest from our colleagues across Australia, so we'll be looking into that. And I did mention our Australian panel meeting for C2 that was held 2 weeks ago. Some of the main things we discussed was our preparations for the Paris session in 2022. I'll be the special reporter for preferential subject 2, which relates to operational planning strategies, methodologies and supporting tools. And we also discussed possible Australian contribution nomination to the large disturbance workshop, being the trip of multiple generators and transmission lines in Queensland that occurred on the 25th of May of this year. Looking forward, topics of interest that we might want to progress. There's a lot of interest in geometrically induced currents, or GICs, as we start to head towards our next solar maximum, which is expected around about 2025. There's some work done as part of the up to the last solar maximum, and we'd be very keen to reinvigorate that work and work with some of our colleagues across the industry to progress some of that work. The future of under-frequency load shedding in the presence of widespread DER. How can we make under-frequency load shedding much more dynamic and adaptive to changing loads on the power system where there's significant embedded generation on distribution feeders? And one that was brought to our attention from colleagues in New Zealand was the potential for the impact of our changing operational practices on power system equipment. If we're switching equipment more often to manage voltage situations across the network or other such things, what might that be leading to in terms of performance of the power system equipment? So plenty of topics to interest us and keep us busy over the next little while. And that concludes my presentation on Australian Panel C2.